Shalom, everyone, and welcome to AZM's Anti-Semitism, Anti-Zionism, and Holocaust Denial Project's webinar on Unpacking UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, its history and funding, bias in education, and the Palestinian perspective. AZM is an umbrella organization comprised of 33 national Jewish Zionist organizations working across a broad ideological, political, and religious spectrum, linking the American Jewish community together in support of Israel, Zionism, and the Jewish people. It is the U.S. Zionist Federation and the World Zionist Organization. Before we begin, I just wanted to say a few words in memory of the passing of Irving Roth. For those of you that were able to join our first AZM, Anti-Semitism, Anti-Zionism, and Holocaust Denial Projects webinar, we featured Irving Roth and another Holocaust survivor. And I feel so blessed that we were able to share Irving's unbelievably insightful and words and his wisdom and his life's work that has impacted all of us and will continue to do so even in his passing. Irving was a Holocaust survivor who spent his life sharing his stories, sending the message out to everybody how important it is truly to never forget and to ensure that it never happens again. He reached young people, he reached adults, he reached Holocaust survivors, he reached Jews, he reached non-Jews. And I think that it's truly a loss. And for the entire AZM community, may his memory be for a blessing. Today, I am excited to be moderating a very important panel, both because of how timely it is given recent current events surrounding UNRWA, and in particular, its educational materials that indoctrinate Palestinian students against Israel and Jews, but also because so many individuals and organizations have been studying these matters for decades, and we're finally seeing a more public recognition of the problems within UNRWA. Today's event will be recorded, and you can also submit questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We have three expert panelists who have a lot of information to share in this short time, but I'm going to do my best to get to as many questions as possible later in the program. I also wanted to let you all know about our next webinar, which will be held on March 18th on campus anti-Semitism, and featuring Eliza Lewin of the Brandeis Center and Tammy Rossman-Benjamin of Amcha Initiative. Before introducing our panelists, we have a special guest from Hadassah, also known as the Women's Zionist Organization of America, that performs critically important work in so many areas relating to Israel and the Jewish people. Ellen Hershkin is a member of our Anti-Semitism, Anti-Zionism, and Holocaust Denial Project, who will be sharing what Hadassah has been working on with regard to UNRWA. Ellen is the chair of Hadassah Israel Travel and the immediate past 26th national president of Hadassah. She has previously served in many roles at Hadassah, including as the coordinator of the Education and Advocacy Division on the Young Judea Scholarship Committee, as the national secretary, as a former national vice president, as national chair of Hadassah's Membership Outreach Department, and as national chair of the Public Affairs Department and the Hadassah office in Israel. In addition to her work for Hadassah, Ellen has served on the board of directors of the Jewish National Fund, the United Israel Appeal Board of Trustees, and was a member of the American Jewish Congresswomen's Roundtable. Ellen, thank you for being with us today.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you. Thank you for joining this important conversation hosted by the American Zionist Movement, AZM. Thank you, Lauri. As you stated, I am Ellen Hershkin, the immediate past national president of Hadassah, and I'm thrilled to be working with you, Lauri, our moderator, and AZM, Anti-Semitism, Anti-Zionism, Holocaust Denial Project Chair. And our panelists today, Asaf Romirowsky from Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, Marcus Sheff from Impact SE, Institute for Monitoring Peace and Cultural Tolerance in School Education, and Bassem Eid, a Palestinian human rights activist, political analyst, journalist, and old friend of Hadassah, who was a presenter on our Defining Zionism series. As Lauri said this afternoon, we're going to have a thought-provoking conversation. I'm not going into the background of all that will be discussed by our most esteemed panelists. UNRWA is responsible for running more than 700 schools in Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank for more than 500,000 children. Textbooks for nearly every subject are dotted with blatant anti-Semitism, the glorification of terrorists, revisionist history, and the delegitimization and demonization of Israel. All of this is against UN Charter guidelines, and it's happening nonetheless. It's dangerous, it's been going on for a long time, and it must change. UNRWA must do better. From our position as an organization with special consultative status with the UN Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, through our policy statements on anti-Semitism and United Nations reform, and in our advocacy on Capitol Hill, we, Hadassah, have made two things abundantly clear. Anti-Semitism anywhere is a threat to Jews everywhere. And the UN should stop funding UNRWA until anti-Semitic curricula are removed. To help reach that goal, Hadassah has been working to hold the Palestinian Authority and UNRWA accountable. During the 116th Congress, Hadassah was proud to work with Marcus and Impact SE to support legislation sponsored by Representatives Brad Sherman and Lee Zeldin, the Peace and Tolerance in Palestinian Education Act, which would have directed the State Department to report annually to Congress on the school materials used by UNRWA. We hope to continue working on this legislation with the new Congress. Of course, this is not the first time Hadassah has been a leader in championing legislation that combats anti-Semitism through education. We are proud we have played a key role in advocating for the Never Again Education Act, which was signed into law on May 29, 2020, that will provide much needed funding and resources toward Holocaust education in our schools. Anti-Semitism, discrimination, hate, bias is intolerable, zero tolerance, and education is the solution to erasing hate and intolerance. We are duty bound to establish an environment where open-mindedness is encouraged, where learning about each other's differences is sought after, and where respecting the diversity of people and opinions is viewed as an essential component of developing an inclusive society. Hadassah will continue the work we have started in Washington to shine a light on this important issue and ensure United Nations accountability. We look forward to working with our partners to accomplish our shared goal of creating a more peaceful society. So without further ado, I am now happy to turn this program back over to Lauri Regan and our esteemed panel. Lauri, back to you.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for all the amazing work that you do and for all the work that Hadassah does. It's critically important, and thank you again for being here. Our first panelist is Asaf Romirowsky. As Ellen shared, he is the Executive Director of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, of which I am a board member and the treasurer. Asaf is also a senior non-resident research fellow at the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies and a professor at the University of Haifa. Trained as a Middle East historian, he holds a PhD in Middle East and Mediterranean Studies from King's College London, UK, and has published widely on various aspects of the Arab-Israeli conflict and American foreign policy in the Middle East, as well as on Israeli and Zionist history. Asaf is co-author of Religion, Politics, and the Origins of Palestine Refugee Relief, and author or co-author of many journal articles and book chapters on topics relating to international relations, the Middle East, and Arab-Palestinian refugees. He recently co-edited Word Crimes, Reclaiming the Language of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, a special issue of the journal Israel Studies. Welcome, Asaf. Can you start our discussions by providing us with some background on UNRWA, explaining its history and the refugee question that we've been reading about lately? In particular, what's the difference between the United Nations High Commission for Refugees and UNRWA? And why has the UN distinguished Palestinian refugees from all of the world's other refugees? If you could also touch on the study that was conducted by the State Department at the request of Congress in 2012 and explain why you believe that study remains classified, including its conclusions on the estimated number of refugees. Thank you, Asaf.
Thank you. Thank you, Lauri. Thank you, AZM. Thank you, all the partners who made today happen. And of course, it's an honor to be here with my friends and colleague, Marcus and Bassem. Those of us in the UNRWA rodeo, we've all shared the podium and the panel together. So it's nice to be here, at least even virtually. we don't have a lot of time, Lauri, so obviously I wrote a whole book on the topic, but let me try to highlight a few important salient points that I think are relevant to the uniqueness or the special case study of UNRWA at large. UNRWA was defined from the get-go really, as a special case study, as a special organization. Its uniqueness regarding, in contrast to UNHCR, is the fact that UNRWA comes to the scene, historically speaking, before UNHCR. As a result of the historic formation of UNRWA, it allowed itself to define and redefine itself even before there was a UNHCR, because UNRWA comes about in 1949 and UNHCR comes about in 1950. So there is that, that time period that allows them to define and redefine themselves. They were also, interestingly enough, defined by their own charter as a temporary organization, clearly temporary that has no end, because they kept on recreating and redefining the problem. Now, what is unique about UNRWA in itself really has to do, and this goes to the last part of your question, which I will get to, is really how a refugee is defined by UNRWA. UNRWA uniquely defines Arab Palestinian refugees, and I paraphrase here, as anybody who was in mandatory Palestine between 1946 and 1948, and the kicker has been, and their descendants. The lineage aspect is really something that has become unique to UNRWA. No other refugee population has had that element, and it is really what has been the main catalyst and what has allowed UNRWA to thrive, grow, and prosper through all these years. UNRWA today, if you ask them how many refugees are there worldwide, they'll say they're between 5 and 6 million, and the numbers continue to grow. And the correlation, of course, has to do with the fact that every time they go to donor countries, and up until the Trump administration came to power, the U.S. represented a third of UNRWA's annual budget, and now under the Biden administration, there is discussion about re-upping the money. So every time there is a discussion about asking for more funds, it is based on the so-called number of refugees, which again is the heart of the issue of where all these numbers come from and who is the population that UNRWA is actually serving. The other part of it, which I think is also unique to the historical definition, is in contrast to UNHCR and other refugee populations worldwide that have been around since wars have happened and people have been resettled and whatnot. You can only be a refugee normally for one generation. Again, the fact that UNRWA has been able to maintain and sustain this problem and to grow it from generation to generation is at the heart of the problem. I have argued for years, and I've continued to argue that in my writings and in the book I wrote on the topic, is that Arab Palestinian identity is actually rooted and synonymous to Palestinian refugees, which is why there has been a consistent refusal to give up the refugee status. To say to most Palestinians, and Bassem, would probably confirm, this, when he speaks about this, is to say, if you're no longer a refugee, say you're no longer a Palestinian. And this is part of the correlation that exists within the Arab Palestinian identity that plays into this narrative. American and Western powers at large have been major stakeholders in the entire Arab-Israeli enterprise and the entire Palestinian peace process at large. American involvement in general has been involved in this from the beginning. Prior to UNRWA coming to the scene, actually, it was under Dean Acheson and the individuals in Lake Success under the Quakers who actually had responsibility for the Arab Palestinian refugees. That's a whole other lecture and a whole other story, which we have no time to go into today, but I wrote a book on that topic. But the fact is that since the 70s and going all the way to today, there's been ongoing congressional reports about trying to figure out studies about the number of refugees. There has been an understanding at large by American foreign policymakers and diplomats and others that the refugee problem is indeed a problem. The question is, how do we solve it? And is there actually resolution for the problem? I would argue that in American foreign policy terms, and this is really, where I think we went against our own American foreign policy in the 50s and 60s was rooted in three issues: resettlement, repatriation, and reintegration. Within the case study of UNRWA, we have gone against every possible element of our own American foreign policy by allowing this enterprise to grow and to flourish as a result of having no end to the problem itself. And we have become stakeholders in the problem. And really, I would say we've amounted to actually growing the problem. I mean, I would say rough amounts of money that I've calculated, and don't quote me on this, but approximately since we've started investing in this project, quote unquote, we have spent close to, in today's numbers, close to $68.3 billion over the course of the past over 70 years within these monies that we've invested in the project, which seems to have no end and no end goal to all of this, because every year the numbers continue to grow. Now, going to your point about the congressional study, and that was done back in the Obama years, again, this is a continuation of different congressional committees who've looked into the topic. There have been many congressional legislations going back to people like then Congressman Mark Kirk under the UNRWA Accountability Bill, and other individuals who've gone beyond that to try to figure out and do a needs assessment about what UNRWA is about. And part and parcel with that is really, who are the constituents, meaning who are the numbers. The findings and the rumors about these numbers really, have amount to what I would consider to be real numbers of who they are, refugees today, which are obviously an amount on average between 30 and 35,000 people. That relates to the actual numbers of the original 48, 49 of actual first generation refugees, unlike where UNRWA is today, when you're talking about third, fourth, and almost fifth generations that are going into the reality at large. And so if you had to have a resolution for the problem, and by the way, past American brokered Israeli-Palestinian conversations on the peace process have always brought up the question of trying to resolve the refugee problem. Israel has always agreed to actually give compensation for the original 48, 49, plus more numbers. I mean, this has always been the game about trying to resolve the problem itself, but that was never enough. I mean, it was always a constant debate about what is going to be enough. And part of the fact that this has never been enough is because of what my earlier point has to do with the fact that this is considered to be a right. I would even say a divine right, that no Palestinian leader has the mandate to give up, something that is actually quoted and actually happened under Abbas's years, when early on he tried to put the refugee issue on the table and was said, you have no authority to do so, because this is the divine right of refugees, the right and how it's interpreted within Palestinian politics. So when you go to the congressional numbers and the declassified numbers that we're estimating exist, if we were to accept those original numbers, which are much less than the millions of refugees that are accounted for under UNRWA's accords, then what would that mean for the American taxpayer dollar that we've been paying, for years now, not including the past 4 years, on average between $360 and $400 million a year in American taxpayer dollars, based on the so-called quote unquote natural growth of Arab Palestinian refugees. And so one would have to question exactly where'd all that money go, and what did that amount to, in general. I will say, from my own interaction with UNRWA officials and individuals, every time there has been a request for an audit, they have been flatly denied. They can't tell you how many laptops they bought, how many pencils they used. UNRWA is one big black hole of money. And so again, part of the needs assessment that plays into the conversation is, what are we serving and how is it intending to grow? That's what needs to happen, as far as going forward, and as far in general, as far as UNRWA's move at large. I would say one more point, and I know that my time is tight and short, is that you can't, the idea is that UNRWA today, in its current configuration, is acting, to my mind, as a shadow government for the Palestinian Authority. What you need to do, and UNRWA is also the largest employer of Palestinians altogether. These individuals should be, if there is going to be a Palestinian state in whatever configurations later on, they should be state officials, and there should be a slow but sure weaning off of Palestinian society, UNRWA, off of Palestinian society at large. Because in its current configuration, UNRWA has a hold on the entire architecture. And of course, my friends and colleagues here will talk about their number one product, which is, of course, the education and the school system. But that is, in a nutshell, the historical landscape and kind of American foreign policy and how it plays into all of that.
Thank you, Asaf. You did pack a lot of information in, and I appreciate that. I now want to introduce Marcus Sheff, who is the CEO of the Institute for Monitoring Peace and Cultural Tolerance in School Education, more commonly known as Impact-Say, a research and policy nonprofit that analyzes textbooks employing standards on peace and tolerance as derived from international declarations and resolutions. Marcus worked as a political reporter at The Nation, an editor at the Jerusalem Post, and a foreign correspondent. Following that, he was an executive for global communications firms Dow Jones International and AdventStar Inc., and established the Word Shop Limited, a communications firm that became the leader in its field. He was the executive director at the Israel Project from 2007 to 2014. Thank you for joining us today, Marcus. The results of your very important work have been in the news quite a lot over the past couple of months. And in particular, we've read that UNRWA officials are now admitting that there are anti-Israel and anti-Semitic narratives and incitement of terrorism and rejection of peace that are being taught to the Palestinian students. Can you please share with us the results of your study on UNRWA textbooks and why this is now significant, given that others have been investigating and talking about these biases for quite a long time? And can you also explain the difference between PA, the Palestinian Authority, and UNRWA-funded educational materials and programs in terms of where they're used, and where does Hamas come into all of this, if at all?
Certainly. Thank you very much indeed, Lauri, and thank you to the AZM. It's a pleasure to share a platform again with Asaf and with Bassem. I would also like to thank Ellen and to recognize Hadassah's leadership on this issue. We are at Impact SE so proud to work with Hadassah and with the excellent Karen Pakin-Barrell in DC. This is ongoing work. We have a lot more to do together, but it is a partnership we are very proud of indeed. So what did we learn? To begin, we already knew that UNRWA teaches the new Palestinian Authority curriculum in its schools. 1.3 million Palestinian children being taught in all those Palestinian schools, of which 320,000 go to UNRWA schools. So that's the, if you like, the first piece, and I hope that is helpful in understanding a little bit of that division. Now, the Palestinian curriculum, which UNRWA teaches, is one of the most radical we have ever studied. Peace is not presented as preferred or even as possible. Jews in these textbooks are liars, fraudsters, enemies of Islam. They control finance, media, and politics. So anti-Semitism really suffuses this curriculum. 6-year-old children, so grade 1, are taught reading through the words martyr and through the word attack. 9-year-olds learn maths by adding martyrs. How many in the first intifada, how many in the second intifada, how many do you have? Palestinian teenagers are taught that dying is better than living, essentially a Salafi idea. I could give you, many examples, but I think people are aware of the problems of the Palestinian curriculum. And, UNRWA have always said we have no choice. We have to teach the curriculum of the place where our schools are. Now, Impact is proud to have taken this issue, the issue of the Palestinian curriculum, to governments and to legislators worldwide, and even to the United Nations, by the way, where we spoke about this and it was condemned for its anti-Semitism. The European Parliament has condemned the Palestinian curriculum twice, and Norway actually cut funding to the Palestinian Authority because of this curriculum. So the awfulness of the PA curriculum is not new to us, but this is what is new. UNRWA wrote their own school materials in 2020. We reviewed them. And, you would expect a UN organization, we were going to see something really different, something that we could live with, something where peace and tolerance were respected. So news, they were just as bad as the materials of the Palestinian Authority. They violate UN values, UNESCO standards, UNESCO, of course, being the UN organization dealing with education, and actually UNRWA's own stated principles. They promote hate teaching, incitement to violence, glorification of jihad, martyrdom, and terrorism. So, one or two examples. Students being called upon to defend the motherland with blood. This is UNRWA material, directed to passages that glorify terrorists, including Dalal Mughrabi. UNRWA have always said, we have nothing to do with Dalal Mughrabi. In this material, students are pointed to where they can learn about Dalal Mughrabi. Israel, obviously UN member state, erased off all the maps and called the enemy in UNRWA material. There are dangerous libels and conspiracy theories, such as Zionists intentionally set fire to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Israel deliberately dumps radioactive and toxic waste around Palestinians. Jihad acts of violence are encouraged in UNRWA material. And this one is new, by the way. We found an exercise created by UNRWA which condemns normalization agreements between Israel and Arab states. Again, a UN organization condemning the idea of peacemaking. So first of all, how did UNRWA respond? The day after our first report came out, they embarked on I think it's fair to say, a very impressive damage limitation exercise. The UNRWA Commissioner General, Philippe Lazzarini, acknowledged that inappropriate, as they call it, UNRWA produced materials were mistakenly printed and distributed to over 300,000 students in UNRWA's care. Bizarrely, the statement blamed UNRWA's own teachers for the creation of these materials. Why bizarrely? Because these teachers are supposed to be trained in UN values of peace and tolerance. But UNRWA decided to dump it all on their teachers. UNRWA claimed it detected and dealt with the problems, again, I quote, promptly, by removing and replacing all materials by November. Now, that's 8 months. If the materials were written and first distributed in March, and they claim, UNRWA, that it stopped in November, 8 months. That is 8 months of hate teaching and certainly not prompt. But here's the kicker, we released yesterday a follow-up report showing that insightful UNRWA material is still being taught right up until now. So here's the bottom line. UNRWA evaded accountability, and Asaf talks about this quite rightly, and transparency. He says they don't know how many laptops and pencils. We do not know what is in their teaching materials, and education is the majority of UNRWA's budget. UNRWA immediately locked down all access to these teaching materials, literally the day after the publication of our first report. An astounding idea. They provided no evidence of when they identified the hateful material, when the internal review took place, if it ever did. I would hazard a guess that that is not the case. There is no proof of any newly produced educational materials, no explanation of how UNRWA will collect this harmful content because it was printed from over 300 homes in the West Bank and Gaza. Again, it will not. I think we know this. And of course, this raises serious questions about all of those claims about the training of their teachers. I think I've covered all those points, but there was just one more, how Gaza fits into this. Well, the majority of UNRWA's schools are in Gaza. So that answers that, but obviously also in the West Bank. Thank you, Lauri.
Thank you, Marcus, and for your tremendous work. You've discovered and disclosed to the world some very scary concepts that we'll talk a little bit more about. I'm very pleased to introduce Bassem Eid, a Jerusalem-based political analyst, human rights pioneer, and expert commentator on Arab and Palestinian affairs. Bassem has spent 26 years researching UNRWA policies and has written extensively on the subject of UNRWA reform and is an outspoken critic of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Bassem, thank you for being here. And can you share with us, from the perspective of the Palestinians, the influence that UNRWA has in the Palestinian community? What type of work does it do in the disputed territories, and how much of an influence on the Palestinian people does the bias that Marcus just discussed play in attitudes towards Israel and Jews? I think you are muted, but Bassem, you're muted. There you go.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Thank you. And what I want to say, unfortunately, that the incitement and the hatred of UNRWA towards Israel will never ever be stopped while the international community is continuing funding and supporting UNRWA. That's one of the major problems. I must have to tell you that from the $1.5 billion, which is the yearly budget of UNRWA, the major of that funding is coming from the international community rather than it is coming from the Arabs. Secondly, we remember last year when the former President Trump decided to cut the funding of UNRWA, which used to be around $360 million for 1 year. I must have to tell you that UNRWA already succeeded to raise a triple of that amount from other countries like the UK, like Canada, like Japan, like Australia, like Germany. So we did nothing by cutting the American support, which is $360 million. We just did nothing. Now, on the other side, I'm going to shock everybody right now by saying something. Last week, the British Council in the UK gives UNRWA schools in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip the International School Award. The British Council, the UK, not the Palestinian Authority, not the Jordanian government, not the Syrian government, not the Lebanese government. The UK government gave such award to the UNRWA schools in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. So while the international community will continue supporting UNRWA, how I can really raise awareness against the curriculum which is full of incitement and hatred towards the Jews? How I can do it? I must have to tell you that in the past 5 years, I probably appeared over than 20 times at the Capitol Hill lobbying and campaigning against the curriculum of UNRWA in the Palestinian schools. And in each time I met a congressman there, when after they are hearing me, they start saying, oh, it's horrible. We should have to do something. But after I left the Capitol Hill, everything evaporated and I never ever heard anything from those congressmen. That's one of the major problems. The question is how we can make the international community accountable here. In my opinion, the international community via UNRWA continue sacrificing our children and misleading our children by teaching them such kind of a horrible curriculum. The problem, in my opinion, is not the Palestinians at all. The major problem is the international community who are funding such kind of a hatred and violent and incitement curriculum via UNRWA. This is one of the major problems. I didn't see right now that the international community try to be involved or to interfere. Even that, all of the international community, I must have to tell you, they have the English translation of the all UNRWA textbooks in the schools. All of them, prime ministers, ministers of foreign affairs, they have it, but no one is really interested to do anything. In my opinion, this is a policy, the policy called anti-Semitism policy. And while Europe want to push such kind of anti-Semitism policy, I think that they are using UNRWA, they are using Palestinians, they are using BDS, they are using so many organizations around the world in terms to push more and more forward their own policy, which is called the anti-Semitism. This is really one of the major problems that, in my opinion, we the Palestinians are suffering from it. But in the meantime, if we want to put an end, we should have to start dealing with those funders who are allowing UNRWA to teach such kind of a horrible curriculum and who are giving UNRWA such a huge amounts of money in terms to keep on its own anti-Semitism policy in the Palestinian schools. You know, when I heard about the British Council gives the award to the UNRWA schools in the West Bank and Gaza, it shocked me. It looks like that Barack Obama is going to get the Nobel Prize, yeah? For what? For what you are going to give Barack Obama the Nobel Prize? For what you recognize the UNRWA schools as international schools? I don't think that there is anything international over there. And this is the problem. And that's giving UNRWA, by the way, more power, more energy to continue with their anti-Semitism policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bassem. We greatly appreciate your passion on this issue and your work on this. There's a lot of questions in the queue. I have a couple of my own, so I'm just going to touch on a couple things quickly and try to get to the Q&A really as much as possible. But you, both Bassem and you, Asaf, have touched on the funding of UNRWA, and you mentioned, I mean, I saw the statistic that from 1950 to 2018, American taxpayers have contributed more than $6 billion to UNRWA. The Trump administration suspended that funding, recognizing it as, or UNRWA as, quote, riddled with waste, fraud, and concerns of support to terrorism. But the Biden administration has indicated it's going to resume funding. And people have asked, you know, how do we stop that? Does the Biden administration, are they going to look into what's, you know, the underlying textbooks, perhaps Marcus's study? But in terms of funding, the UAE also just announced that it will not be funding UNRWA in 2021. So while Bassem mentioned that other states are now making up what the U.S. has, you know, has discontinued, at least for now, what does this mean for UNRWA's ongoing operations? Is there a way to leverage funding based on their curtailment of incitement through education? And also, Asaf, I know that in the past, the argument was always, well, the Israeli government wants this funding to continue because if UNRWA didn't exist, then all of these things, these infrastructure type and administrative type programs would have to be picked up by the Israeli government. And what are the Israelis thinking now that we really see the incitement that's coming out of their educational programs?
So there are a few complex issues to kind of unpack, but Israeli foreign policy, just to kind of start with your last question, has been that, you know, as you mentioned, if UNRWA doesn't do it, it's going to be Israel's problem, which is not true. You know, again, our Israeli colleague and friend Einat Vilf is probably the first one who was able to produce a letter from the defense ministry arguing that they're acknowledging that they won't go against their own initiative, that is to deal with the ending the right of return and dealing with the larger issue of the incitement at large. Netanyahu is the first Israeli prime minister to go on record to say that UNRWA should be dismantled. But again, there are a lot of problems, you know, for Israel and basically overall COGAT, which is the civil administration that basically governs this entire kind of relationship. They really don't have a true understanding of history and politics. It's more of a immediate security needs, and so it's kind of the evil you know versus the evil you don't know when they're dealing with UNRWA as a partner agency. Today, you know, Israel does not contribute monetarily to the architecture. That, you know, again, it's about trying to create buffer zones and trying to deal with the landscape as far as dealing with the Palestinian Authority. I think that has changed now, but again, there are other problems that they're dealing with at large. Where does UNRWA fall in the priority list for them? But you know, in contrast to past years, when there has been proposed American legislation, you know, regarding cracking down on UNRWA, then the individual would usually get a call from the embassy saying, look, you know, this is a good, you know, let's not really be so aggressive about this, kind of back down. those calls are not happening as much these days as a result of the kind of the changed attitude, understanding what is actually UNRWA producing at large. So that is to kind of understand and to deal and to look at that. Now, to your first question, you were asking about the Lauri, the first part of the question.
I was asking you about, what's going on with the funding, and if, if Biden resumes and the UAE.
Right. Where is that going? Yeah. So that part of the question is, again, there has to be some kind of outcomes. And again, this relates to my point before about transparency and accountability. Over a decade ago, the Canadians were the first Western government to defund from UNRWA based on the lack of accountability and transparency. And what they said was, we're only going to fund projects so we can get back some kind of sense of what is happening there. Interestingly enough, the Canadians defunded because of the incitement in the textbooks. And so what has changed over the past decade? As Marcus shows, and as Bassem, attests to, nothing has changed. And so here we are in a situation again where we defunded UNRWA for the past 4 years. Now the Biden administration is going to go into it again. And so the question is, what are the metrics that they have to show that UNRWA is actually reformed? There have been reform measures proposed by Congress, on a bipartisan level, looking to see, about cracking down on terrorism, cracking down on incitement, things of the sort. And when you ask them for their deliverables about to kind of prove these issues, clearly Marcus's report and data shows the opposite of that. So the question goes back, if we're going to get back into the UNRWA rodeo again, and we're going to put up again another $400 million, what is that buying to the American taxpayer dollar? I would argue that, this is a symptom of the other part of the problem, which we spoke about in my earlier remarks, as far as ending the right of return. There has to be an ending of the right of return, because the ending of the right of return correlates to the growing number of, this is the demographic argument against the state of Israel. If there are so-called 6, 7 million individuals all claiming a right of return, they're looking to basically take over the state of Israel with those numbers. That's a demographic argument. And versus the actual, and are they really refugees? And the argument has been, if there was a Palestinian state to come to fruition, let them go back, let them go to that state to be. That is not the argument. It's a replacement theology of basically taking over the state of Israel by process of demographics. And again, these are all the elements that play into the money aspect here that we need to ask for. I do think positively the fact that the UAE is going to back off on its funding is quite telling and quite revealing about the strength of the Abraham Accords. And that's a positive element if the Arab world is going to follow suit on that, to say exactly, there are gold standard of refugees and there's refugees worldwide, as we've seen, with Syria and other cases that are people who are really suffering as a result of the architecture of who UNRWA actually takes care of. And that really was revealed even more so even in the Arab press during the Arab Spring back in 2008. But we're seeing more of that even these days.
Thank you, Asaf. I'm going to jump to, instead of the question that I had for you, Marcus, I'm going to jump to one that somebody just sent in, who is asking if you can expand on UNRWA in terms of education. And it's a 4-part question. Do their schools go K through 12, or does it extend into university and postgraduate studies? What other educational systems are there in the Palestinian Authority in Gaza, i.e. religious schools, private schools, non-UNRWA public schools, et cetera? And how do UNRWA schools and materials compare to those in other parts of the Arab world? This person is also asking if non-Palestinian Arabs think there's a problem with UNRWA, or do they support them? But I think maybe we'll leave that for Bassem. But if you could touch on some of those other questions, Marcus.
Okay, and if I can remember them in that order. So the answer is, to the first question, K through 9. UNRWA schools do not teach, except for one school actually in Jerusalem, bizarrely, they don't teach the Tajiyah, the graduation grade. How other schools? Well, the majority of schools are Palestinian Authority schools. There is a minority which are UNRWA schools, and then there are all kinds of networks, the Waqf system, the Islamic school system, churches, independents, private schools. But this is, you know, a small chunk, and I think the important thing is the majority of those are teaching the Palestinian curriculum. So if, you know, there are very, very few schools all in all, which are, you know, teaching anything outside of that. There might be an Anglican school which is teaching, you know, a British, you know, British matriculation, or German school. There is actually a German school which, you know, teaches half Palestinian authority curriculum, half German federal curriculum. But majoritatively, if you like, public schools, majoritatively PA curriculum is being taught. Fascinating question about the others. So there's good news is the answer to that. There are positive changes being made in the region. So, you know, I remember that I said that this was a new Palestinian curriculum. It was adopted in 2016 for grades 1 to 4, 2017 grade 5 to 10, and then the last two grades in 2018. It is the only curriculum that we have studied, and we study curricula across the MENA region, which actually got worse. For instance, the UAE curriculum has a remarkable moral education course. It teaches wasatiyah, the middle way, moderation, tolerance, respect, and peacemaking. And Sheikh Mohammed Ben Ziyad reformed the whole national curriculum, which was written by the Muslim Brotherhood, as so many curricula in the region are, which makes them, you know, so extreme, so radical. But he both throughout the Muslim Brotherhood teachings and actually the Muslim Brotherhood teachers themselves who were teaching this, we are reviewing it now, so no spoilers, but I will say it's very interesting. Jordan, King Abdullah II reformed that curriculum in 2014 after the Amman letter of 2004, Amman conference 2005, and it is more inclusive and more tolerant set of books. A lot of problems with Israel, you know, really a lot of problems with Jerusalem. You know, one cannot whitewash this, but we did see improvements. And this is, you know, really important to say, particularly in how Islam and other religions are portrayed. The Tunisian curriculum, you know, we've said for a long time that this is a good curriculum. It educates about the importance of negotiations, peace, respect for the other. They teach about their own French colonial past without hatred. Saudi Arabia is a really interesting case. Always been high profile, always had a very extremist curriculum, and always been on the, you know, a target, if you like, especially obviously after 9/11, when 15 of the 19 terrorists were Saudi and bin Laden himself. We reviewed it in 2003, awful. 2008, awful. 2019, you know, marginally better, but still awful. We wrote a review which was taken to the Royal Palace, and significant changes were made. Great chunks of anti-Semitism was taken out. Homophobia was taken out. Again, there are still a lot of problems, and I have to say this, it is by no means a job done, but they are on the way. And so, you know, if the person who asked the question is looking for a wider canvas in which to place the PA curriculum and the UNRWA curriculum, the wider canvas is there are either attempts and improvements. Morocco, King Mohammed VI is now, you know, teaching about Jewish Moroccan history in Moroccan textbooks. We're going to make sure that's the case, but this is what we have heard. So that wider canvas is people really trying to improve, and the PA and UNRWA absolutely not. And by the way, obviously not everybody is. The Iranian curriculum is appalling. It's genocidal. Talks about, you know, sheer hegemony in the region and the end of days and how everyone's going to the sword. You know, the Syrian curriculum, which we reviewed in 2018, is bonkers. You know, it is a pan-Arabist curriculum where, you know, Nirvana is this, you know, big pan-Arabist state. It has Soviet overtones and is anti-Semitic. So even within that, countries trying to improve, many are not. But I will say again, the PA and UNRWA are remarkable for the fact that they are recidivists. There is no intention there to improve. On the contrary, they intentionally wrote a worse curriculum, the PA, which came out in 2016. UNRWA intentionally teaches it, and then in 2020 wrote its own material, which is just as bad as the PA's. So I hope that answers all of those questions.
It does, Marcus. Thank you so much.
I
Bassem, I'm going to Oh, yeah.
Sorry, just want to add, very little thing here, that UNRWA is not only operating in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. They have also schools in Jordan, they have schools in Syria, and they have schools in Lebanon, where, probably the majority of the Palestinian refugees probably are living in these three different countries. On the other side, I want to remind everybody here that just 4 months ago, everybody remember the Abraham's Accord, yeah, between the United Arab Emirates and the Kingdom of Bahrain and Israel. And it was a kind of normalization accord rather than a peace accord. I must have to tell you that 2 months after the United Arab Emirates signed the normalization accord with Israel, immediately they changed their curriculum at the schools, and now they start teaching more towards peace, towards forgiveness, towards reconciliation, towards the Jewish people. So it is very possible, to do it. It's so small thing to do it. But the question, who really want to do it? I don't believe that UNRWA really has any kind of willingness to do so.
That's a really important point, and thank you for making that. And I'm going to present to you sort of a combination of a couple questions that people have put in the queue and that I was going to present to you also. Somebody wrote that Palestinian poet M. Darwish acknowledged that the only reason that the Palestinians have so much support from the West is not because of their cause, but because they hate Jews so much. And so this person is asking, how widespread is that awareness among Palestinians? And I would ask, is hate for Israel and Jews endemic in the Palestinian culture, or is it something that's just being taught in the schools? And what do you propose to end the indoctrination? I know you don't support BDS. And by the way, you wrote a recent column regarding what's going on at Brown University, and thank you for that. But what is a pervasive view among Palestinians on BDS and other anti-Zionist endeavors? Is there a difference between what's thought on the Palestinian street versus the echelons of the Palestinian governance, of which UNRWA is a critical part?
In my opinion, while the West is supporting the Palestinians, it doesn't mean necessarily that the West loves the Palestinians. I think that the West supporting the Palestinians in terms to use the Palestinians, in terms to mislead the Palestinians, how to be more and more anti-Semite, because that's exactly what the West right now is fighting for. This is one of the real problems here. And I used to say that if the West will stop supporting all of these anti-Semitized organizations, I believe that we will kill this anti-Semitism within 24 hours. But while the West is still running and supporting such kind of anti-Semite organizations like the BDS, as an example, that you have parliaments in Europe who are supporting the BDS, parliaments in Europe supporting the BDS. So the question is how we can really stop the BDS activities while these parliaments in Europe are continue supporting them. This is the issue. I don't think if you will come to any ordinary Palestinian right now and asking him, what are the most three priorities that you are seeking? He will say a job to survive, to secure, to secure the education system and the health system for my children. Nobody is talking about state. Nobody is talking about settlements. Nobody is talking about anything. I think that the majority of the Palestinians are ordinary people who just want to survive and to secure the future of their own children.
Thank you, Bassem. There's a number of questions in the queue regarding the refugee question. So Asaf, I'm going to combine a couple and ask, why did UNRWA decide to include descendants of refugees, whereas in other cases, descendants were not included? And why do the other refugee organizations not protest to the UN and refugee accepting countries that the unique definition of refugees, which UNRWA is allowed to maintain, why don't they object to that? So for example, my understanding is that UNRWA distributes more money per capita to Arabs in Gaza than the amount that any other refugee gets from the UNHCR.
So this is
Eh,
kind of the double standard, the gold standard that you see here between the two kinds of refugee classes. UNRWA represents the gold standard. I mean, again, look, even if you think about it from the historical narrative, I mean, 1946 to 1948, there wasn't a modern state of Israel in 1946. So the idea that you've created the insurance that basically, you're going to that this this is where the beginning of the Palestinian narrative begins, as far as the original sin. That is the idea of Israel's coming to fruition in 1948, and the consistent reminder that we are going to oppose Israel in every possible way is through the symbolism of refugees. This is really, the crux of the issue. At every time, I mean, look, there was a proposal, for example, already in the 1950s, that was proposed by the Israeli government under Sharet and under Ben Gurion, when at the time the Quakers were involved and Dean Acheson and others, and the question was that would Israel take in, between 250 to 300,000 of the original. Again, the numbers, depending on the scholarship, differ about between 10 to 15%. You're talking about at the end of 48, 49, about close to 650,000 Arab Palestinian refugees. Out of those numbers in the 50s, the proposal was Israel would take half of them. The only caveat was, again, this is again in the 50s, put it into context, that they would accept Israel's right to exist in peace. And of course, the answer was flatly no, knowing that the refugees would be the consistent reminder of 1948, which, by the way, is exactly the reason why no country, with the exception of Jordan, has ever offered the Arab Palestinian citizenship. The mantra and the idea of the statelessness is really what has continued to exacerbate the conflict. To that end, what you have is in this environment is you have this standard where the Palestinians have basically, this is a case study of what I would call where the client has hijacked the service provider, because basically UNRWA today is run by the amount of internationals that are running the show is very much a minority in comparison to the larger Palestinians. And they're the ones who have basically been able to define and redefine the agency as a result of buying into this echo chamber and this understanding. And so they keep on redefining the issue and ensuring the fact that the Palestinians will maintain the upper hand here. So when you compare that to other agencies, and actually there has been a kind of a reality check, as I started to say before in your last question about the Arab Spring, where Syrians were fleeing for their lives after Assad was gassing its own people, and the Palestinians were asking for, were saying, we're still the #1 refugees, or the fact that UNRWA offices in Lebanon were refusing to give services to Syrian refugees. So that double standard has, become quite significant and quite revealing. But when you compare it to other refugee countries, other refugees in general, again, the UNRWA issue, because it was defined as a special case study, and the fact that there is still no Palestinian state, allows this to grow and to flourish. And again, if you compare between World War II till this day, there have been millions of refugees worldwide. All have been assimilated with the exception of the Arab Palestinian refugees. To give context into the historical record about resettlement and repatriation of Palestinians, given the political connotation of this issue and how this plays into the general Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I would say, and this is really the crux of the issue. So long as the so-called right of return and UNRWA exists by extension as the gatekeeper of that problem, the conflict will continue to grow. This is the one guarantor that the conflict continues to grow. So every time there's a proposal to shut this down, even by comparison to other refugee populations, this is shut down.
Thank you, Asaf. Um,
Well,
we, we still have a lot, I'm sorry.
sorry, I want just to add something very small towards what Asaf said about the right of return. You know, last week, the Palestinian TV made an interview with the spokesperson of UNRWA in the West Bank. You know what the spokesperson of UNRWA said? He said that UNRWA will continue operating in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip till the last Palestinian refugee will return back to his original home. Listen, this is a political statement. This statement should have to come out from leaders, not from spokesperson of such corrupt organization. So that's also a containing a kind of incitement among the Palestinians refugees towards Israel. Look in which way they are succeed to incite against Israel.
Thanks, Bassem. It's 1:30, but we're going to stay on a bit longer because there's a lot of questions. So if people want to join us for another couple of minutes, I'm going to try to hit as many questions within the next 5-10 minutes, maybe. This is for Marcus. A lot of people are asking if there is a way to access the UNRWA materials so that we can see them and present them here in the United States in order to educate others. And I guess that would be including our congresspeople, our lawmakers. Where can we get at the textbook? And is it also possible to show the UAE textbooks, for instance, which were rewritten years ago in order to prepare their society for peace and tolerance to the international community and let them compare those to the UNRWA textbooks so that helps, it makes a compelling argument.
Yeah, great question. So I just want to refer to what Bassem said. This politicization is in the textbook. So essentially the same idea. You have UNRWA, UN organization with intensely political ideas in its textbooks, which even within the context of the PA are problematic, within the context of UNRWA are unconscionable. In relation to the materials, everything is on our website, is the bottom line. So the answer is yes, impact/se.org. What is interesting, by the way, is, as I mentioned, UNRWA closed everything down. They moved all of the materials to a secure server. Despite that, we do have this material, but you will find it there. Feel free, I think it's on the left-hand column, along with all our reports, and we have reports of curricula across the Middle East. To the UAE, what we have on our website is a report of the moral education curriculum, as they call it, course, I think would probably be a better word. And as I said, we are doing a full review of the UAE curriculum now. We believe that will take another maybe 2 months, but that will be available to all. All our reports are available to all. Unlike UNRWA, we are completely transparent. And that's, going back to Asaf's point, that is, entirely the problem here. Their lack of transparency, the shifting of everything onto secure servers as soon as any information was found. This is an international organization supported by the international community. And these are textbooks, not nuclear codes. There is no need whatsoever for this stuff to be made secret. If it is being made secret, we clearly have a problem. There was one more question, Lauri, which I might have forgotten. I apologize. What was the last one?
I think it was generally asking how people can see the textbooks and there's a way to sort of compare and contrast the UAE's textbooks with UNRWA's.
So there it is. So there it is. And of course, all these textbooks are in Arabic. We translate, and so, you would obviously need those translations. Hence, please do feel free to use our reports. Our reports are used all over the world, literally from New Zealand to California, and everybody is welcome to use those.
Lauri, you should also note, just to Marcus's point, not to forget for the viewers to know, that many of the congressional language asked to see the textbooks and actually used Marcus's work and other translations to see what's going on in the textbooks. That was part of the mandate and the stipulations for some of the trying to put conditions on the money. by the way, as far as American congressional language that was put out there, as far as transparency and accountability on the textbooks.
But Asaf, on that point, and a lot of people are asking in the queue about funding and how we can get the U.S. to, under the Biden administration now that seems to be reversing the Trump policy on this, how can we get the U.S. to stop the funding, whether you look at the Taylor Force Act, which I don't think is necessarily directed towards UNRWA, but are there means that we have to cut off the funds to UNRWA?
Look, the number one issue was, had to do with Section 301C, which related to the question of the incitement of terrorism. And so American congressional, language had to do with the fact that if you can make the argument prove that we are not enticing and supporting terrorism, they should be cracked down on. I mean, Taylor Force obviously is an example of a different kind of scenario, but again, in a similar situation as far as the incitement of terrorism in Palestinian textbooks, in particular regarding UNRWA issues. But there should be preconditions and there should be stipulations on money. I mean, money should not be a black hole as far as going into the issues. And so going back to the Kirk Amendment, going back to the Liana Ross-Leighton Amendment, the UNRWA accountability language, going back to even of recently to what the proposed language that the Langford bill put forward. I mean, again, there's opportunities to look at historical American language and, and going back even to bipartisan language, which, that was agreed upon going back to the days of Tom Lantos, who was taking Kofi Annan to task on these matters. I mean, there is bipartisan language if the Biden administration is going to be proactive on this matter before it decides to hand off $400 million of American taxpayer dollars while we are dealing here with the pandemic worldwide. And so where's your priorities? And if you're going to give this money, great, but figure out where that money actually is going to, what it's actually going to do. What is the end game of this money besides throwing it into a black hole that's going to be renewed year in and year out? And UNRWA historically has always claimed to be poor. There's never a time where they don't ask for more money. And that's going to continue and, in perpetuity unless we put a stop to it.
Thanks, Asaf. So we are sort of winding down the program. I want to just ask you all if, to maybe give some final comments. People are asking, what can we do? Can we reach out to our Congress people? Should we be reaching out to people at the UN? And so perhaps, Asaf, we can start with you, and then we'll go on to Marcus and Bassem with some final thoughts on the topic and what can be done and what needs to be done going forward. Asaf.
Look, just the final words. I mean, I think that, what we're doing here, Lauri, is great. I mean, education of constituency is important. We got to do more kinds of education to educate people on what the problem is. And above all, we have to talk to our elected officials. These are American taxpayer dollars. And so there has to be a demand about where this money is going. And so, and there has to be an end game. You're going to invest in money. So what is the end product? But the number one issue has to be about educating ourselves, educating others about what the issue is, and lobbying for these matters. Because again, to my mind, this is the number one single issue that ensures and maintains the conflict. And so long as this is still in play, the conflict will never end. And that's what is never understood about the priority of trying to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic. And so that's where I think our effort should be as far as educating the issue. And again, these things have been done on a bipartisan level that can be renewed and should be renewed in order to show what American taxpayer dollars are actually putting their money in.
Thank you, Asaf. Marcus?
Well, nothing to add to Asaf. Agree on every single point, and I'm clearly not an American, but I would say Hadassah is leading on this issue in the US, and we are delighted to be working with Hadassah on this. They will have the materials for people to be educated, and they will have the materials so that policymakers can then be educated. That would be my best advice in relation to people in the US.
Thank you, Marcus. Bassem?
Last comment here, I want to go from where Asaf stopped. The worst funding looks like impossible to stop funding UNRWA. But at least if it is impossible to fund UNRWA, at least to condition the funding towards UNRWA. Now, what the Americans can do, I don't believe that the Americans can do that much, by the way, unless in two different steps, or to make a big intifada in front of the Capitol Hill against funding UNRWA, or to stop paying taxes to the American administration if that taxes is going to UNRWA.
Thank you, Bassem. I think unfortunately, we already had an intifada in front of the Capitol early in January. It didn't go over too well.
No.
Now, on behalf of the AZM's Anti-Semitism, Anti-Zionism, and Holocaust Denial Task Force, I can't thank you all enough. Ellen, thank you for your remarks and for everything Hadassah is doing, as Marcus pointed out, and Asaf, Marcus, and Bassem, thank you for joining us today for what was really a terrific panel. People in the comments section are asking for a follow-up, so maybe we will reschedule something because there's still a lot to talk about. But thank you for all of the work you're all doing.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
All the best.
And thank you everyone for joining. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.